I'm very happy to have him here as a keynote speaker about Racket theory, about Horkheimer, and maybe a little bit about solidarity. I don't know if it's here. And John, we are very happy to have you here, and we are curious to talk.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, to you and Inga and all of the students and everyone else who helped to organize the conference. It's been great. Thank you. I also really wanted to thank Harold Marcuse, Andrew Lamas, other people from the Marcuse Society who gave me some financial aid to get me here, which is very much appreciated. Okay. And I've definitely been humbled and inspired by all the excellent papers I've heard so far. And, I have to tell you, this is definitely a work in progress. Peter asked me to speak about the racket theory about 4 months ago. It wasn't a topic that I studied very carefully before, so I've learned a lot about it, though, in the past few months. I'm going to present you with my findings here today. And the racket theory was developed mainly by Horkheimer. Of course, as you all know, this is a conference on Marcuse, so I wanted to make it relevant to Marcuse. So I decided to place the racket theory into a broader context. And I don't know if we can go down to the outline part of my paper. So I wanted to place the racket theory into the broader context of social regression in modern capitalist societies. And in the paper, I want to look at 3 different models of social regression. So the first is Marcuse's analysis of fascist theology in his 1934 essay, Struggle Against Liberalism in the Totalitarian View of the State. That's A, 4A up there. And then the second model is the racket theory from Horkheimer, which can be understood as an attempt to understand the regression of liberal capitalism into monopoly and state capitalism in the middle of the 20th century. The third model is an essay that Marcuse wrote. It was an unpublished essay, but he wrote it in 1972. It's called The Historical Fate of Bourgeois Democracy. And this essay, Marcuse analyzes the potential threat of U.S. democracy sliding into neo-fascism, which, as we all know, is a very relevant topic today. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to that last part of Marcuse, which is unfortunate, but I will do my best. Let's see how far I get in the paper. And Peter, you have to tell me when my time runs out. So, but overall, so these are 3 different models of what I will call here regressive progress in bourgeois society. And I think they provide important insights into tendencies that are still at work in contemporary democracies. I'm a historian by training. My approach here is going to be more historical, but as we know, history is still with us in the present, obviously. And I think these models give us an understanding of social regression, which I think is a weakness of some of the more recent normative approaches in critical theory. They don't give us a good idea of they can tell us where we ought to be going. They can't really tell us why we aren't getting there. So I think this is important to go back to the early critical theory and look at their analyses of social regression. So this is the second concept of regressive progress. Shortly after joining Horkheimer's Institute for Social Research in 1933, Marcuse published his first essay in the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, Struggle Against Liberalism in the Totalitarian View of the State. In that essay, Marcuse analyzes the fascist critique of bourgeois society as a type of regressive progress. Fascist ideologists attack liberalism for defining freedom and individuality in purely private terms. They call for a politicization of existence that redefines freedom in relation to a broader political community. At first glance, these claims seem to resemble Hegelian Marx's critique of liberalism, insofar as they point to the limitations of abstract definitions of freedom, which separate it from the structure of society as a whole. But on closer examination, the fascist progress beyond liberalism reveals itself to be purely regressive, insofar as it fails to address the root causes of social domination in modern capitalist societies. Marcuse argues that the fascist critique reflects a reorganization of capitalism, not a step beyond it. Because the fascist critique remains within the bounds of bourgeois relations of production, the progress it supposedly represents, and here I'm quoting Marcuse, operates regressively. The process of politicizing and deprivatizing annihilates individual existence instead of truly raising it to universality. End quote. From our perspective today, it's hard to imagine how fascism appeared at that time as progress beyond liberal capitalism. But its historical success provides evidence that many people did see it that way. Marcuse was obviously among those who saw through the fascist ideology of progress, but his argument raises the important question of the relationship of societal regression to the underlying dynamics of bourgeois society. To what extent was the transformation of 19th century liberal capitalism into monopoly capitalism and then to fascism a natural product of bourgeois society itself? And of course, there are lots of people who will deny any link between bourgeois society and fascism and authoritarianism. I think, in the field of history, the Sonderweg argument, says that fascism was caused by persistence of pre-bourgeois structures, right? And so then the solution to fascism is to more modernization. And this, I think, is, as Finn pointed out, I think in the first day of the conference, quite different from the approach that we see in critical theory. So first, I'd like to demarcate the concept of regressive progress from the more psychoanalytically oriented concept of progressive regression that Marcuse would introduce later in Eros and Civilization. By progressive regression, Marcuse meant the possibility of an emancipatory reactivation of earlier stages of psychosexual development in a society that has moved beyond the repressive performance principle. Whereas Freud demonstrated his proximity to the evolutionary theory that dominated 19th century bourgeois thought by positing the genitally centered heterosexual male as the psychosexual norm, and anything that deviated from that as a perversion or perhaps arrested development. Marcuse argues that in a highly advanced society without surplus repression, the polymorphous perversity of the body could be recovered in a way that wouldn't threaten the stability of the individual or society as a whole. For example, Marcuse argues that sexuality in the service of reproduction would give way to a more erotic attitude of sexuality dedicated to, quote, obtaining pleasure from zones of the body. One could place the two concepts of regressive progress and progressive regression in relation to one another, for example, by arguing that the former concept represents a barrier to the realization of the latter. But in this paper today, I'm just going to focus on the idea of regressive progress. So now I'm going on to section 4. Well, at section 3, I'm skipping that just because I don't have time to talk about it, but I was just going to give an overview of the concept of bourgeois society, which I'm sure all of you know has a long history in Hegelian Marxism and critical theory. In Hegel, and of course in his philosophy of right, he, develops the concept of bürgerliche Gesellschaft and shows the contradictions that exist within bürgerliche Gesellschaft. And Marx, as we know, turned to political economy because he believed political economy revealed the anatomy of bourgeois society, right? Horkheimer, I think in the 30s, expands the idea of bourgeois society by talking about the anthropology of the bourgeois epoch. So bringing psychoanalysis into the concept of bürgerliche Gesellschaft. Adorno, I think it's interesting that Adorno referred to the United States as a radical bourgeois society, right? Sometimes people say, well, bourgeois society is limited to the 19th century, and once we get into the 20th century, we can no longer, but I don't think this is the approach that the critical theorists took. And even Habermas, some of you will remember his early book on the structural transformation of the public sphere. The subtitle of that book was An Inquiry into a Category of Bourgeois Society, right? So even in the early Habermas, this plays an important role. So whatever happened to the concept of bourgeois society as as an analytic concept as well, right? Not just necessarily a polemical concept.
So, okay, so now I'm going on to section 4a. Marcuse's essay, Struggle Against Liberalism in the Totalitarian View of the State, provocatively argues that deep continuities exist between 19th century bourgeois society, what he refers to mainly in the essay as liberalism, and fascism. So at the same time, Marcuse also strongly emphasizes the ideological discontinuities between fascism and certain progressive liberal philosophical ideals, such as a rationally organized society, that were rejected by fascism. These latter more progressive ideals he refers to as the ideas of 1789 and argues that they were never realized in bourgeois society. In short, Marcuse examines both the identity and the non-identity of bourgeois society and fascism. Marcuse explains the regressive progression of bourgeois society in the late 19th and early 20th century in terms of the crisis of liberal capitalism and its subsequent transformation into monopoly capitalism, which undermines the legitimacy of the ideas of 1789. Important for Marcuse's argument is not only the new forms of economic organization that emerged in the late 19th century, such as cartels, trusts, massive expansion of European imperialism, but also the crisis of legitimacy these economic developments create for liberal ideology. As sharply critical as Marcuse is of the underlying economic logic of bourgeois society, he is also careful to defend the genuinely progressive ideas of 1789 from fascist and other right-wing critics of bourgeois society. Marcuse's essay is important not only for highlighting the dangers of trusting naively in the underlying economic logic of modern capitalism. I don't think many people do that anymore, but also the essay is also important for illuminating the differences between the left and right-wing critique of bourgeois society. In fact, the bulk of Marcuse's essay is dedicated to an analysis of fascist and conservative revolutionary intellectuals in Germany, such as Ernst Kriek, Oswald Spengler, Müller-Vandenbroek, Carl Schmitt, and also Heidegger. I don't have time to explore Marcuse's rich essay any further here, but I would like to emphasize its importance as a trenchant analysis and critique of right-wing populist and conservative revolutionary critiques of capitalism, which are enjoying a resurgence today. Think of someone like Alain de Benoist, or so-called national Bolshevist currents, these various right-wing critiques of capitalism, and we need to know how to respond to these as well. If we want to preserve a genuinely progressive critique of bourgeois society, we must distinguish it clearly from such reactionary critiques. So now I'm moving on to the section on rackets. First, the context of the racket theory. We've just seen how Marcuse attempted in 1934 to grasp the rise of fascism in Germany as a politically regressive reorganization of society facilitated by the transformation of liberal into monopoly capitalism. By the end of the 1930s, Marcuse, Horkheimer, Adorno, Friedrich Pollock, Franz Neumann, and others were engaged in a new debate about whether or not monopoly capitalism had, over the course of the 1930s, developed into a new form of what Pollock called state capitalism. I don't have time to provide an overview of these important debates here, with which many of you will already be familiar, but I would like to make clear that Horkheimer's racket theory was developed in the early 1940s as an attempt to grasp the regressive aspects of the further development of capitalism in the 1930s. Horkheimer's racket theory confirmed some aspects of Pollock's state capitalism thesis, but overall, the theory provided more evidence for Franz Neumann's critique of Pollock, which Neumann articulated most clearly in Behemoth, the monumental study of National Socialism he first published in 1942. The key point for my purposes here is that Horkheimer's racket theory was an attempt to grasp processes of social regression that had progressed decisively in the 1930s and early 40s, and not only in Germany, but also in the United States. What's also interesting, important, and very little known about Horkheimer's racket theory is that it was originally intended to be published as part of his and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment. The racket theory was intended to provide the social and economic foundations of dialectic of enlightenment through an analysis of contemporary society. In the end, the research project Horkheimer initiated on rackets was abandoned, and Dialectic of Enlightenment was published without a fully developed section on recent social and economic developments. So looking more closely at Horkheimer's racket theory also sheds a lot of light on Dialectic of Enlightenment and demonstrates that it was indeed, as the authors explicitly stated, a book of philosophical fragments. In other words, Dialectic of Enlightenment was not intended to be the magnum opus of the first generation of the Frankfurt School, as it's commonly seen today. And anyone who reads German and wants to learn more about the racket theory, I highly recommend this book. Very thick, as you can see. Thorsten Fuchshuber, Kritische Theorie der Bandenherrschaft Racket. So I've learned a lot. I want to give credit to him for some many good insights on this topic. The racket theory also developed out of a perceived need to revisit and reformulate Marx's critical theory in light of recent social and historical developments. Horkheimer and Adorno focus in particular on Marx's concept of class and how the transformation of capitalism from liberal to monopoly to state capitalism had also transformed the concept of class. Horkheimer and Adorno were deeply concerned about the integration of the working class in the new, totally administered forms of state capitalism that became dominant in the 1930s. Horkheimer's interest in the concept of rackets developed in part through research he was doing on the recent history of the labor unions in the United States. He feared that the significant gains that unions made during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency had also weakened workers' will to fight against capitalism as a whole, and had shifted power away from rank-and-file workers to the leaders of large unions. So this is the section 4b2 content of the racket theory. The racket theory of society was developed mainly by Horkheimer, so let's take a closer look at his concept of a racket. At the most general level, a racket is a particularist form of collective self-assertion that provided protection to its members in exchange for strict obedience. And I was reminded by a paper by a Mexican colleague this morning that rackets also use violence in many cases, as we know, right, from the mafia. So it's this is, I think, I didn't mention that here. I wanted to mention that. In a society in which autonomy becomes increasingly impossible, powerless individuals seek desperately to preserve themselves by joining rackets. The individual subordinates herself to the group in order to participate in its collective power. Governed solely by the principle of group self-preservation, rackets are thus anti-universal. They reject both the rule of law and principled solidarity of political struggle. Horkheimer argues that rackets are linked to the social division of labor. Rackets exist at all levels of society, but their relative power depends upon their importance to the overall reproduction of society. Rather than cooperating harmoniously with one another, rackets engage in constant struggles to secure and enlarge their power. Thus, rackets are fundamentally conservative insofar as they seek to preserve their own privileges within the social order as it exists. Try as they might, however, rackets do not displace the underlying dynamics of society as a whole, but they do conceal these dynamics also to their own members. Finally, Horkheimer argues that rackets have always existed. The creation over time of more complex societies may have created a more complex constellation of rackets, but it does not change the basic structure of rackets as a form of social domination. Even though Horkheimer emphasizes the trans-historical character of the racket form, he developed the racket theory in the early 1940s as a way to grasp the transition from liberal to monopoly capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then from monopoly capitalism to state capitalism in the 30s. In his 1941 essay, The End of Reason, Horkheimer described this regressive transformation of capitalism in the following way. Quote, the new order represents a transformative shift from bourgeois to direct domination, while at the same time continuing bourgeois domination, end quote. Horkheimer makes clear that in contrast to the new forms of direct domination that have reemerged in recent times, the mechanisms of bourgeois domination during the liberal phase of capitalism were indirect. That is, they were mediated by various social forms that had originally played an emancipatory role in the historical triumph of bourgeois society over feudalism and absolutism. Most important among these forms were the universal claims of bourgeois ideology, which proclaimed equal rights for all, establishment of a constitutional state with a monopoly on violence, which was used to enforce the rule of law, the rise of the modern market economy, which created a new sphere, independent sphere of circulation, put an end to serfdom, other forms of direct personal economic dependence. Horkheimer followed Hegel in claiming that modern bourgeois societies were the first to establish subjective freedom as a universal principle, and that bourgeois societies give rise to a new form of the family, which possessed relative autonomy vis-a-vis the state and civil society, bürgerliche Gesellschaft. When viewed in comparison to the feudal social forms that bourgeois society overcame, these and other historically emancipatory features are recognizable. At the same time, of course, Horkheimer realizes that all of these new institutions and ideals continue to conceal a new form of social domination specific to modern bourgeois societies. Horkheimer gives Marx credit for revealing the ideological content of these institutions and ideals. After Marx's death, however, the forms of 19th century liberal capitalism that he so astutely analyzed were gradually undermined by the rise of imperialism and monopoly capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th century. The same tendencies toward the concentration of economic power remained dominant in the 1920s and were supplemented by powerful tendencies toward centralization of economic power that emerged in response to the Great Crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. Horkheimer grasps this regressive transformation of bourgeois society as the gradual elimination of the mediating institutions that had played an historically progressive role during the rise of bourgeois society. Bourgeois claims of equal rights were replaced by racial theories of inherent inequality. The rule of law was undermined by new authoritarian regimes. The market was largely replaced by state planning. Individual autonomy and the relative autonomy of the family were both subordinated to strict allegiance to the state or subordination to the Volksgemeinschaft. At the same time, and here Horkheimer follows Marcuse's earlier arguments, the basic economic foundations of bourgeois society, that is, private ownership of the means of production and appropriation of surplus value, remained intact. It is this abstract negation of bourgeois society that Horkheimer also attempts to grasp with his theory of rackets. Rackets become increasingly dominant in society in proportion to the decline of the relatively emancipatory mediating institutions of liberal capitalism. The gradual undermining of individual autonomy in the family led powerless individuals to join rackets in a desperate attempt to survive. The decline of the market makes it increasingly difficult for small businessmen to compete with large conglomerates and cartels, once again forcing them to join one of these rackets in order to survive. The decline of the rule of law and constitutional state creates a climate in which the illegal activities of rackets can flourish. In relation to Nazi Germany in particular, Horkheimer argues that the formation of rackets has come so far that the society could, quote, dissolve at any time into gang warfare, end quote. This statement that seems to indicate Horkheimer's agreement with Neumann's analysis of Nazi Germany as an anti-state, in which the Nazi Party, big industry, the military, and the state bureaucracy all struggle with one another to increase their share of social power. Although Neumann himself was critical of the racket theory and did not refer to these powerful social groups as rackets, his analysis of the destruction of the rule of law and the replacement of constitutional state with a power struggle by dominant social groups illustrates well, I think, Horkheimer's racket theory. Next, I'd also like to say a few words about how Horkheimer's racket theory represented an attempt to rethink and update Marx's critique of political economy and his concept of class in particular. The two main texts, both unpublished, in which Horkheimer elaborated his theory of rackets, are a lengthy aphorism entitled Die Rackets und der Geist, Rackets and Spirit, I guess, and a longer essay on the sociology of class relations. During the same time, Adorno also wrote a text called Reflections on Class Theory, which can be interpreted as his contribution to the racket theory. Horkheimer and Adorno argue that the concept of a more or less unified class made sense during the liberal phase of capitalism as an expression of the more or less unified and opposed interests of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. With the development of monopoly and now state capitalism, the unity of both the ruling and the working classes has disintegrated into different groups pursuing their own particular interests. The concept of a racket is intended to capture group loyalties that increasingly take precedence over allegiance to one's class as a whole. And here I think we can see the links to solidarity and how rackets essentially destroy certain forms of solidarity. Right? Such processes of disintegration occur among both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Horkheimer and Adorno describe the formation of increasingly rigid hierarchies within each group. Under liberal capitalism, bourgeoisie consisted mainly of smaller-scale owner-entrepreneurs, but with the rise of monopoly capitalism, large corporations become increasingly dominant, which results in increasing bureaucratization and concentration of economic power. Petty bourgeois businessmen lose their autonomy, become directly dependent upon large trusts and cartels. The abstract domination of the law of value, which under liberal capitalism asserted itself behind the backs of both workers and the bourgeoisie, gives way to a system in which the interests and decisions of the most powerful individuals and groups have a decisive impact on larger economic developments. The agency of the bourgeoisie, or at least of its most powerful members, is restored under the new system of, what Adorno called the total organization of society by big business, end of quote. The categories of Marx's political economy, which were developed to grasp the abstract forms of social domination that operated under the law of value, are no longer valid in a society in which the direct power of small ruling groups has been restored. On this point, Horkheimer and Adorno echo Pollock's state capitalism thesis, which also posited a new primacy of politics over the abstract economic imperatives. Turning now to the working class, it's important to note that Horkheimer's original interest in racket theory grew out of research he was doing in the late 1930s on the history of the labor movement in the United States, and in particular in the rise of big unions in the United States in the 1930s. The concept of a racket came into widespread usage in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s in relation to organized crime and the rise of big unions, which could not always be neatly separated. Union membership in the U.S. spiked in the 1930s, going from 12% to 27% of workers. The growing strength of organized labor in the U.S. continued a trend that had begun earlier in Germany and other European countries. Already in the late 1920s, Horkheimer had analyzed the tendency in Germany of the working class to be fragmented into different groups based on their location within the new social division of labor created by monopoly capitalism. 5 minutes? Okay. There already, Horkheimer described how unionized workers acquired an interest in the preservation of the status quo based on their understandable desire to maintain jobs that were relatively well-paying in the precarious context of Weimar Germany. With his racket theory, Horkheimer argued that such tendencies toward the integration of unionized workers into the status quo became even more pronounced with the rise of big labor in the United States. To be sure, unions achieved higher wages, better benefits, and more job security for workers, but to obtain such gains, workers largely forfeited their autonomy. They subordinate themselves to union leaders who have an even larger personal interest in the perpetuation of the status quo. Unionized workers and their leaders adopt a positivist, pragmatic, and particularist attitude. The organization of labor becomes just another business. Like other rackets in society, unions try to increase the portion of socially generated surplus value that accrues to their group. Whereas the leaders of socialist parties had fought for the interests of the working class as a whole, that is, for social justice and ultimately the abolition of a society in which classes existed at all, the leaders of large unions dedicate themselves to particular interests of members of their particular group. Within such large labor unions, individual workers must accept the decisions of their leaders. Big business is willing to work with the leaders of large unions because they are predictable. They also exercise control of the workers, for example, decreasing the risk of strikes. Older forms of solidarity with the working class are supplanted by common interests of union leaders and employers. At the same time, the organization of many workers into large unions also creates new outsider groups. Horkheimer mentions non-unionized workers, but also workers living outside of what Horkheimer calls the privileged nations, who are dominated not only by their own traditional elites, but also by leading groups in industrialized countries. And here, people will recognize a similarity with Marcuse and his analysis in One-Dimensional Man of the integration of the working class, which creates new outside groups. So this is anticipated by Horkheimer. So I'm going to stop there. I mean, I was going to talk about some of the problems I see with the racket theory. One of them is a kind of trans-historical category of the racket, which I think shares some of the same weaknesses with some of the arguments in dialectic of enlightenment, and moves away from the more historically specific categories of his early work. Also, I think the racket theory reflects conditions in the mid-20th century when unions were on the rise. Of course, since the 80s, we've seen a decimation of unions, and I don't think the racket theory is necessarily very helpful in understanding. I mean, now in the US, of course, we're seeing a kind of resurgence of unions, which I think is great. But Horkheimer, they're I think, anticipating some of the developments that happen in the mid 20th century in terms of, the affluent society. But why don't I just stop there and open it up for some questions? And I'm sorry I didn't get to the last part on Marcuse in the early 70s.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for this overview. I'm a little bit disappointed with your last sentence that we don't need the racket theory, that it's
No, I mean, I think we get a lot of insights from it, but it's kind of like Arendt in the Origins of Totalitarianism. I don't think it's the key to history as the whole, and that's what it seems like. It's like they have this idea that rackets existed in ancient Greece and in the medieval period, and it's always just the selfish interests of the So I think we still need a historical theory of capital and bourgeois society.
Okay, thanks. Some questions. We have a little bit time. Ooh. Keep it short and simple.
Yeah, I have a political Marxist question.
Okay.
On kind of maybe the relationship between racket theory and the theory of primitive accumulation. Because as you were presenting, I started thinking about the whole transition to capitalism in the actual existing socialism. the decade of the 90s happened under the sign of this notion of racket. Rackets were everywhere, and we usually understand this process on transition from socialism to capitalism as kind of primitive accumulation that happens again.
Yeah.
So, and as you're presenting this fascinating theory, I thought that maybe racket theory applies better. And if so, what would be the relationship between the theory of primitive accumulation, there's some sort of like more political accumulation, not through capital, but through more coercive means, and racket theory. And of course, the same problem of a historical nature also applies to both.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, primitive accumulation occurs with the aid of the absolutist state, right? So there you see outside of Europe, the state is participating in primitive accumulation, where, as you mentioned the 80s and the 90s and the transition from socialism to capitalism, it's very much an anti-statist climate. And also I mentioned Behemoth, right, where it seems that in a way, racket theory seems more relevant to neoliberalism because it has this very, I mean, some people have argued, of course, that, the state is also central to neoliberalism, which, I think it is, but the rhetoric, at least, is that, when the end of the constitutional state creates a situation in which it's kind of a free-for-all, right? And I mean, I was struck by the colleague's paper this morning from Mexico talking about the narco trafficking and how the government is kind of just hands off and letting, we see this in many places in many countries, the so-called informal economy, right? And so, it's strange, I find myself, well, Pollock also had the idea of democratic state capitalism, right? The idea that, do we need to go back from Marx to Hegel and defend some idea of a state as necessary and providing democratic, power and agency against the bourgeois society?
Thank you very much. My question is, I mean, we know that the late Horkheimer is getting much more conservative than the early Horkheimer, right?
Yeah.
And would you think that the racket theory as something that problematizes, especially unionizing, is already a sign of conservatism, or what would be the political input you would see in the background? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I would say, I think what I looked at, one of the things I talk about in my book is that in the 30s, you still have this idea of a dialectic of bourgeois society in Horkheimer's work, which basically, sees bourgeois society, at least in Europe, in the early modern period, as a progressive force, and then getting into the 19th century, of course, bourgeois society becomes regressive, the emergence of the bourgeoisie as the new particularist power. And so one thing I do think you see happening in the early 40s is there's a kind of a shift to a new narrative in Horkheimer's work, a kind of rehabilitation of liberal capitalism, right? So in his early work, he's still quite critical overall, he has a more critical approach, but then, suddenly liberal capitalism becomes the new, standpoint of, and so I in that way, I think that it does anticipate some of his more conservative positions later in life. But he's not there. I mean, it's still, the critique of unions is supposed, it's supposed to be a friendly critique insofar as, there were conservative tendencies in the unions at that time. And he never loses sight of the fact that, the union rackets are always subordinated to the rackets of capital and big business, right? He doesn't lose sight of the fact that there's still a power relation there, but he sees rackets as pervading all aspects of society. But I think this sort of rehabilitation of liberal capitalism begins to, I think, pave the way for some of his, in the 60s, he becomes almost like a Cold War liberal, right? It's at least in his public pronouncements. If you look at what he's saying in private, you get a little bit different picture. But yeah.
2 questions, and then we go into the panels.
Thank you, John, for this beautiful talk. I would like to know if it's possible to create rackets against capitalism, like union rackets and communitary rackets and so on.
That's interesting. I think Marcuse would say that the ends have to be present in the means, right? It's a racket is you give up your individuality, you give up your autonomy, and you subordinate yourself to the racket. Yeah. So, I don't think so. But you think it might be possible? Yeah. Yeah. That's more solidarity, isn't it? Right? And he stresses brackets are particularistic. They don't, all they care about is their own group's interest, right? This is the difference between a racket. He makes a distinction between a union leader who's only fighting for his union and their concrete interests versus a leader of a socialist party who's fighting for. Well, Rosa Luxemburg said, "What the end is everything, right? It's the end is creating a class war." So I think the rackets they lose sight of that perspective, while at the same time being part of capitalist society, just trying to preserve their own privileges. Right.
Use the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Eduardo, the last question.
Thank you, John. This is an amazing talk. I just have two quick comments / questions. So the first is, I'm thrilled with racket theory. I think it's a great discovery in the last few years, 10 years or so, or even more, like how it's come up in critical theory studies. But it also, on the other hand, reveals a facet of the first generation that I find problematic also, because I think they kind of lose the dialectics in that, because whenever they talk about racket theory, what is the negative of racket capitalism? It's liberal capitalism. Right.
Yeah.
So it's always a section that amazes me, because they were so good at revealing how fascists came from within liberal capitalism.
Right.
And then they just slowly lose that impetus to start talking about racket capitalism.
Yeah.
And they don't, I guess what was lacking there, and today we need to criticize this, is they don't have a systemic view of capitalism. So if you can't really see how liberalism and colonialism don't exist without each other, you're going to fall into those traps, right?
Yeah.
And the second quick remark is that why do they always resort to global south settings to describe this kind of stuff? So it's always something, or even like the periphery of Europe, it's always like southern Italy, right? It's mafioso capitalism. This is mafialization of capitalism. This is gangster capitalism.
Right.
I can't think of anything more gangster or mafioso capitalism than Silicon Valley startups just going to,
That's a good
you know, so what are they doing there?
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, I think to your first point, I think in this way, the racket theory is closer to Pollock's state capitalism, because he says there's a primacy of politics, and that means, in a way, Marx is no longer relevant, right? Because Marx taught us about, the independent dynamic of capital, right? And if that independent dynamic is eliminated, then we need some other theory. And that's why in my book, I say we need to go back to the 1930s before Horkheimer shifts over. And I argue the state capitalism thesis is, in a way, kind of the end of the critical theory. And with neoliberalism, we go back the 30s, the early critical theory becomes relevant again when we come back, because I think that the state capitalism, dialectic of enlightenment, a lot of the work they do in the 40s and 50s, it reflects the conditions of the golden age, or les trente glorieuses, the various expressions we have. But as we know now, of course, that was a passing and short and passing phase, and now since then. So I think we need to go back to the early critical theory. It's more relevant. And yeah, I agree completely. The stereotypes about the South or mafia, this is problematic. I don't think it's, he, as far as I know, he doesn't really talk about the mafia that much. I didn't really come across that in the research I was doing. Marcuse, okay, yeah. But it's clearly a global phenomenon. And I mean, it's looking at the U.S., right? It's looking at the United States, and that's where he really, he comes to the United States and he starts reading about the history of the labor movement in the U.S. and that's really where it comes from. So yeah, thank you so much.